Welcome back to the Hardware Unbox podcast for episode 57. As you might have guessed, we're going to be talking about the GeForce 50 series in this podcast. Main focus on the RTX 5090, the most recent product that's been announced, but a lot of discussion about the implications of what we've seen from the GeForce 50 series, what we're thinking we might be seeing across the rest of the lineup, how competition is going, AMD comes into the picture, that sort of thing. So obviously that's been most of this podcast episode. Bit of a chat on multi-frame generation and frame generation tech in general as well towards the end. And then, nice lengthy discussion about our boring lives as well. So the podcast is not being cancelled. We're still doing it. We're back to talk about products. So let's get into it. Well, Steve, it's been a while since we've chatted. I think we've taken the past month off from doing podcasts, but we're back to talk about brand new and, oh boy, exciting hardware. Very exciting stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
How have you been?
I've been pretty well, thanks. Obviously, been working flat out. I took the time while you guys were at CES to get a lot of testing done. Sort of missed the podcast. I've seen a few comments from people saying, so is this thing like ended now? Is there no more podcast in 2025? But yeah, obviously we've been busy. Tim wasn't even in Australia for a week or so. We've just had releases and stuff, so we've been a bit slammed. And to be fair, I suppose we could have done some podcasts, but it made sense to wait for at least the first of the major releases so we could actually sit down and have a good chat about that. But yeah, unfortunately, it could have been more exciting. Could have been a lot more exciting.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we're going to be talking a lot in this podcast about the GeForce RTX 5090 from Nvidia, and the 5080 is coming up this week. So we'll probably have another podcast at the end of the week to talk about the 5080 and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, I think you put it perfectly in your review when you said it's basically just a 4090 Ti. Like, I guess the thing is, right, like when there's no price to performance improvement, why is it a new generation? Like, it's just the exact same generation. There's no advantage, no improvement there, really. And yeah, I guess it's 25% faster or whatever. So it's a faster product, right? Like, high-end buyers are going to be throwing money to get one of these things to get that 25% gain. But the whole thing I would think that it justifies a new generation is that you're getting more value. You're paying the same amount of money to get more, and you're just not getting that. So yeah, bit disappointing there, but I guess the specs kind of hinted at it a little bit. I think the surprising thing for me, though, is really the lack of any seeming architectural changes or advantages outside of the memory. Like, there's just doesn't seem like there's any IPC gains on the GPU at all. So it's just a bigger GPU. It's uses more power on the same node, and it's faster by about that amount.
Yeah, that's right. As I said in the review, obviously it's the same process node, so there's only so much they can do there. You would expect some sort of architectural refinement, given the period of time that's occurred since the previous release. And I guess there is some evidence of that. They've certainly made some changes, but there's, as you say, no real significant improvement in IPC. So you end up with a pretty underwhelming product in the way they went about things. So as I said, same process node, nothing's really changed architecturally, the end result is quite similar. So that's disappointing. But at the same time, okay, what are you expecting them to do? If they haven't used the same TSMC 4N process, then it is what it is. But again, as I said in the review, there are other avenues in which they could have gone down in order to make this a really exciting release. So obviously one of them is price to performance, improving things there. I think if we got a noteworthy improvement in terms of price to performance, obviously value, then that would have made it a lot more exciting. People with, GeForce 30 series, possibly even 40 series GPUs would be looking at upgrading. And again, stuff like VRAM. So not an issue, obviously, on the 5090. It's kind of gone the other direction there. But we know there's products like the 5070, for example, with 12 gigabytes of VRAM, which not really going to be enough for that product. Certainly not if you're keeping it for... If you look at GPUs now and the realistic lifespan, how long people will be keeping them for, I think at one period of time you could say 2 to 3 years would have been... I'm not even sure if I would say that was typical, but more typical.
Yeah, so, when you were getting 30 to 40% improvements gen on gen, you wouldn't keep it for as long.
Yeah, you were saying GPU releases more frequently, and larger performance gains. So I think certainly in the enthusiast circles, it was every 2 to 3 years. But I think we've got to a point now where it's pushing out more to like 5 years.
Yeah.
For example, a couple of guys in the Hardware Unboxed Discord were saying that, if you compare the 3090 and the 5090, the performance uplift is quite impressive and the gains and everything you're getting there is quite impressive, which makes sense because, the 4090 was 60 to 70% faster than the 3090, depending on, resolution, quality settings, all that sort of stuff. So already a substantial upgrade there. So if you're getting an additional, let's say 25% on top of that, that's obviously a significant performance increase for what should be reasonably similar money, though I'm not sure how true that's going to actually end up being.
Well, the MSRP is $500 more than the 3090.
Yeah, that's obviously a substantial increase, but the 3090 Ti was $2,000, which was dumb, but plenty of people bought it.
Yeah.
But I guess more, I'm being a bit lenient there, like $1,500, $2,000. It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's like, whatever. You're paying stupid money for stupid high-end performance, so bad. But it's sounding like it might be more like if you can get your hands on one. Again, this is pure speculation with some pre-facts. What's the word I want here, Tim? Like we've got strong supporting evidence. I don't know. Basically, we've been told by people in the know that supply is very, very bad, almost non-existent, and launch prices are going to be very bad. So obviously got the FE card that's meant to sell for $2,000 US. So good luck getting one of those. If you've got to turn to a board partner, Asus, MSI, whatever, we're seeing prices as high as I think $2,800, $2,800.
Yeah, which is just
absurd. I think that was for the top end Asus model, but most of them are at least $200, $300, $400 over MSRP. So yeah, but that's got getting back to where I was going before I confused myself 3 different ways. Mm-hmm. If you wait 5 years now, it's like, okay, you can get quite a substantial upgrade. Again, you are definitely spending more money, but then people will talk to or point to rather inflation over the 5-year period, which, sure, that's a thing. Don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but my point is, you are waiting longer now to make a GPU upgrade. So, therefore, stuff like VRAM becomes even more important. So, if you're buying a 5070 with 12 gigabytes of VRAM and potentially holding on to that thing for 5 years, it's just not going to be usable in 5 years because of the VRAM alone.
Well, the issue that product is going to run into, especially for 5 years of usage, is that I would expect another console generation in 2027. Mm-hmm. Obviously the current console generation began in 2020, so 7 years is pretty typical for next generation consoles, which is only 2 years away. In which case, over that 5-year lifespan, it's probably going to straddle 2 console generations. And if the consoles provide more than 16 gigabytes of total memory, which I'm going to assume is going to happen because every time they've tried to increase the level of memory capacity on the consoles, you're going to be stuck at some point with a card that is woefully inadequate in terms of its VRAM capacity at some point during the lifespan, where you're going to get those newer games coming out. Like in 5 years' time, if the new console generation has more than 16 gigabytes of VRAM, not only will 16 gigabytes now be it's already the minimum now, but it might not even be the minimum in 5 years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
when I say unusable or whatever, I mean to a satisfactory degree. So
it's like $550.
Well, it's like trying to live with a 6 gigabyte graphics card now. And look, if you're playing competitive shooters using competitive quality settings, then the whole VRAM discussion isn't relevant to you, which we always acknowledge. But if you're wanting to play, if you're buying a GeForce RTX GPU because you want to play the latest and greatest games, single player games that use the latest and greatest graphics, then VRAM is very important. So you're going to want more of it. And realistically, I think it's fair to say I don't think it's unreasonable by any stretch of the imagination to suggest or really demand that a 5070 should have a minimum of 16 gigabytes of VRAM. I personally, I think it's absurd that it doesn't.
Well, it was always going to be the case. Like, I know what you mean by absurd because it is crazy that the product has that, but it's not surprising. Like, I'm not sitting here going, whoa.
Well, that's a totally different thing, right?
I'm shocked that they...
Yeah, that's a totally different thing. And there's always so much nuance in these discussions. Like, for example, I was thinking about this just before, like, what would you describe the 5090 release as, and what you're expecting based on what we've seen from the 5090 to apply to the rest of the lineup in terms of performance uplift? Like, we've already seen people out there making calculations and suggesting we're looking at like 15%, maybe 20% at best for a 5080 over a 4080. And based on what we already know, that seems very on the money. Like, that's not a wild guess or calculation. So I guess where I'm going with this is, I want to know what your opinion is. But my opinion is it's pretty disastrous for the industry, for Nvidia, but in the sense that I'm not saying it's bad for Nvidia or they're going to do really badly out of this. I just mean it's bad for the product lineup. Like, it's bad for gamers. There's still, all these years later, for a lot of people, not much incentive to upgrade. There's really not much on offer here. And I don't know how much longer we have to wait before we get that generation where you get a meaningful improvement and stuff like cost per frame. You get a decent VRAM upgrade. But yeah, I guess, what's your general thoughts on this release based on what you've seen from the 5090?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, extrapolating the lack of IPC gains and it's scaling pretty much just directly in line with the core count and power, maybe some gains depending on how much GDDR7 plays into it. So obviously more memory bandwidth gain. Limited games are going to have a larger gain. Games that are more on the cores are going to not see as much of a gain. Yeah, based on that, it's looking pretty underwhelming. I would still say that the expectations for some of the products that have been announced so far is probably looking a little better than the 40 series, just because the 4080, for example, was a terrible product just based on, I think it actually made cost per frame go backwards compared to, like, considerably backwards compared to the 3080. So it doesn't seem like that will be the case this time around. So slight improvement.
Well, just to jump in there, though, I think where I'm coming from was because that was so underwhelming and so bad, everyone, well, me in particular, but I think a lot of people were putting their hopes on the next generation really correcting that and being the, because we've talked about the features generation and the performance generation.
Right.
And again, like, we know the reasons for why we weren't able to get more than what we got, but, price, VRAM, there's other ways to add value. And anyway, sorry, go on.
I agree. Like, yes, it is underwhelming. Like, no doubt it's underwhelming. I'm just saying it's potentially, like, not the complete turd that the 40 series was. It's slightly better than that, but it doesn't mean that it's a good generation. Like, I'm not sitting here saying, wow, the 5080 or whatever, or the 5070 Ti is looking like a super exciting product, but it looks slightly better than the 4080. I don't know. But yes, after 4 or 5 years compared to the 30 series, it's clear that it's not going to be a 30 series type of generation or a 10 series type of generation. Like, that's very obvious. And I think there's a number of reasons why that's the case. The first reason would be that back when, we got the 10 series, 20 series, and 30 series, Nvidia's market share, they were still in the leading position, but not anywhere near as much as they are right now. Nvidia's market share is quite likely somewhere between 90% and 80%, so somewhere in there, maybe 85% of the market. Back when the 10 series came out, they didn't have 85% of the market. It was maybe 60-40, maybe 70-30. So they've continued to become more and more dominant. And so in the face of that, what competition do they really have? Like, most people are buying their GPUs. they don't have a strong incentive to produce a super powerful graphics card, especially for these high-end buyers. I don't really know what they're going to offer for people more around the $400 range because, like I've said, they're still competing with themselves. So if they make a very unattractive product,
Mhm.
then I don't really see how that would sell at all. But for something like a 5090, it's pretty clear that they're just going, well, we're the leading company. Everyone buys Nvidia GPUs. AMD's not even making a high-end GPU to compete with this. So why do we have to offer any sort of value gain to customers?
Mhm.
Like, there's just no reason or point to do that. There's no incentive for them to make margins lower to make cards, because they could drop the price of all these cards. Like, they're making a
Mhm.
margin on them. It's not like the 5090 cost $2,000 to make. They could drop the price. There's no incentive to do so. There's no incentive to eat margins, which normally is what you'd have to do in a generation where they're not improving the process node or whatever. The cost of the GPUs is the same or is increased because of new GDDR7 memory or whatever. Again, there's no incentive for them to do that.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. Well,
I understand the position they're in, but yeah, it doesn't make the GPU generation good. Like, I'm not sitting here saying Nvidia's doing all these things and that's perfectly fine. It's like, yeah, it sucks.
well, I think while we're splitting hairs here, and I do agree with you, I think your 4080 comparison is probably the least favorable because the 4090 again was very
Yeah,
impressive.
yes.
And then the parts like 4070 Ti not great, 4070 reasonable, and I think the 5070 is probably going to end up being a much worse proposition than the 4070 was,
Yeah.
um, relative to its point in time. So I'm not saying that, obviously if you can buy a faster 4070 today for $50 less, that's a better product today. But I think if you compare both of the products for the time they were released, I think you'll find that the 4070 is going to end up being better value proposition than the 5070. So I think from the top to the bottom of the stack, I think it's looking to me like the disappointing GeForce 40 series is going to be better than the 50 series. But again, it doesn't really matter. There's no point really arguing that because it is what it
Yeah,
is.
we
We have the
haven't
50
tested
series now, so
we
there's
haven't
other
tested the products, and we haven't
yep.
gotten the lower tier. The thing that really interests me this generation is what they do with like a 5060 Ti.
Yeah, they don't care. They don't care. So it comes back to what you were just talking about. We've been noticing this, obviously. We've been talking about it, but it seems very clear now that what we've been saying is true because, well, first of all, it's extremely obvious. But they made insane profit margins during these cryptocurrency booms, the current AI boom, and they don't want to go back to making small margins on small dies. They don't want to do it. So the strategy here is clearly to push more and more people towards a 5090 type product, which seems absurd, like convincing people to spend $2,000 US on a GPU. How's that going to work? But it's clearly working. Like the 3090 Ti wasn't that successful. It was everyone called it a dumb product. It was almost embarrassing to admit that you wasted money buying one just for the bragging rights. But then you got the 4090, and that was like respect. That thing's an epic
Yeah, yeah.
graphics card. It's awesome. If you had a 4090, you were seriously gaming, and people weren't mocked for owning a 4090. It was like, damn, you've got the coolest, fastest, impressively fast GPU. And they're now pushing further and further towards that. So the higher end is to be lauded over. It's like, wow, these things are just incredible. They're amazing. They're expensive, but they're amazing. Everything below it's just almost garbage. And we're heading more and more in that direction, obviously, with a bigger separation between the 5090, the 5080. And I think we're going to continue to see that, at least while that strategy is working. And it will be very interesting this generation to see what demand for a part like the 5090 is compared to the lower end parts that are potentially very poor in terms of value. Like, what's a 5060 going to look like? Is that going to have 8 gigabytes of VRAM? Kind of know
Yes.
the answer to that one. That is
Not
just
that I
going to
know
be
the answer. I'm just saying that the answer is 90% locked in.
yeah, that's right. So we're 90% sure that thing is going. Don't even need to review it. Biggest piece of garbage, and we'll
Yeah,
see how it sells.
I think the interesting thing that we're going to see with this generation and why part of this is being able to happen the way that it's happened is, again, the lack of competition and AMD just completely fumbling the previous generation.
Mm-hmm.
Once companies like Nvidia start doing the Intel type of thing where you sort
Well,
of...
sorry, yeah. I was just, before you go down there, I want to see where you think Intel are at with this B580, because I think it's a disaster now. We were patient, we were positive about it, but you still can't buy one. They're
I
not.
wasn't talking about Intel GPUs. I
Oh,
was
okay.
talking about Intel CPUs. I was saying,
Oh, right.
go back to when Intel had 90% of the CPU market.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, for gaming, they probably had 98% of the CPU market or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they keep giving up just very underwhelming, very average generation on generation gains. You do leave an opportunity open.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, of course, whether the competition can take advantage of that or not.
All right. Yep.
And so there was always questions during Intel's CPU dominance of whether AMD could take advantage. And for a while they couldn't, because they just didn't have the hardware to do so. They just
Mm-hmm.
weren't anywhere with hardware.
Mm-hmm.
And so if Nvidia keeps going down this path of, as you say, like forgetting about the low end market, just thinking those are trash products, you really should be buying a 5090 or whatever, it does leave the door open for a competitor to come in with a product that will attract people in that range. Whether or not
Mm-hmm.
they do that is, of course,
Sure. Yeah.
who knows, right? But
The
if
potential's there.
Nvidia keeps saying, well, you should be buying these high-end products, we're not really giving you much of a gen-on-gen gain, that is the Intel strategy. And the reason, like if Intel kept giving people big gains generation on generation or value gains or whatever, and didn't just remake the same CPU over and over again for a few years, they probably would have cemented their dominance for a very long period of time. And it would have been even harder for Ryzen to come in.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's maybe a little bit of arrogance with NVIDIA's strategy here of thinking our GPUs are the hottest stuff on the market, which is true, like in a sense that
Yeah,
they make the fastest products. So it's true. But if you apply that to markets where the competition has a chance to make a competitive product, right? They probably don't have a chance. Like Intel's not coming out with a 5090 competitor GPU anytime soon. AMD's not
Yeah.
going to be making that product, but they have a chance in the $400 range.
I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, but also I don't agree. So the problem with Intel was when it became apparent that they were getting their butts kicked, there was nothing they could do about it.
Mm-hmm.
The manufacturing process was not up to scratch. They couldn't do it. To this day, they still can't do it. So they've had to turn to TSMC. And that's ultimately how AMD ended up winning. Because both AMD and Nvidia use TSMC, that same situation can't really happen. As long as the only way it could really happen is if somehow Nvidia just didn't innovate for generation on generation, their architecture fell behind, which it's not going to happen because they're incentivized to push forward for AI and stuff. So
you say that, but like, is this architecture an innovation?
Not, but then they're not. Well,
they effectively went from making an 8-core to a 10-core CPU. It's the same sort of, very similar sort of thing.
Most of the GPU improvements, architectural improvements, have come from node shrinks. Mm-hmm. So I think if you take a lot of these architectures and you remove that from the equation, there's not often huge leap forwards, and certainly not generation on generation. I think you're talking 2 or 3 generations before you get some sort of significant overhaul that could improve things like IPC. I just don't think it's going to be a situation where Nvidia falls behind in that sense. I really don't.
No. But with more competition and leaving the door open, if Nvidia has to respond to that by making their products better, then gamers win. Like either way,
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
either way they win. I'm not suggesting that AMD is going to suddenly have 50% of the market, because that's unfathomable from
and
where they are right now.
Yeah, the Intel situation is just not possible either. I don't believe. I don't think we're ever going to see that on the GPU front. Could be wrong, but I just
not outside of a minor player. Certainly not within the next foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean,
I do think there's some possible pain to be had in the not too distant future, though. With, I don't know, you and I have talked about the AI thing before. I remember at Computex last year, wasn't it, when we weren't that sold on the whole AI hype train, and we were speaking with people within large corporations and companies, and they were asking for our opinions on AI, and we were like, seems to be highly speculative at this point in time, and we're not really seeing applications where it's truly beneficial, and there's billions of dollars being thrown at it by various corporations, but we don't really see where they're going to get their return on investment in the short term. And I think a lot of that's already proven to be true. So I'm not sure how long the AI hype train, let's say, is going to go for. I know we know AI is the future, and there's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
We know it's happening.
We mean not the same rapid scale of investment in it.
Yeah,
and that it will calm down to a more reasonable level at some point.
I think so.
Theoretically.
I think so, yeah. So we'll see what happens there. But if that does happen, then, yeah. If things are going to change for Nvidia, obviously, with their strategy and how they're going about things, because they're going to have to go, rather than large margins, the margins have to come down and go more large volume, I think. But anyway, we'll see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I mean, this generation really could have gone one of two ways. And again, we only have one product now, so we really don't. I guess we're just extrapolating based on what we've seen from the 5090
I think you could pretty accurately extrapolate.
Yeah. But, I mean, it could have gone one of two ways. The first way was they really want to convince people who already own NVIDIA GPUs to upgrade to a new NVIDIA GPU. It seems like they're not super interested in doing that. The other angle was, we're the dominant player, we don't really have to do anything. And it seems like the play they've gone with is more that second path, and which is the same strategy as trying to get you to buy a higher end GPU. Because if you don't have to do anything, you just wait enough time, and eventually a person will get sick of waiting to the point where they're like, well, I'd really like some more performance, and the only option is spending more money, so I guess I'll have to spend more money.
Yeah, I mean, Jensen said that. He said the quiet part out loud. He basically said, we want you to spend more money on these GPUs. You have everyone has a $10,000 entertainment gaming system. So a $2,000 GPU is a drop in the ocean. This is a multi-year investment. So just spend $2,000. And as disconnected as that might sound, that is the logic. That's the messaging. They're like, we offer, we're going to offer a 5060 maybe. We're offering a 5070. I mean, probably don't buy that. 5080, probably don't buy it. Just get a 5090. Like that's what they're pushing people towards. And again, as unreasonable or unrealistic as that might seem, because I don't think you're going to convince someone who wanted to buy a $300 5060 to spend $2,000 on a 5090. I'm certainly not suggesting that was going to happen. But I think you're pulling more and more 5070, especially 5080 owners up to that 5090 price tier. And again, that seems unrealistic given how expensive it is, but it's clearly happening.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a strategy that's more likely to work in the high end than it will for the entry-level stuff. I mean, maybe they'll be able to pull up a $300 buyer to a $400 buyer, but if the 4060 is crap and the 5060 is crap and the 5060 Ti crap, that strategy doesn't really work.
Well, it just pushes people up and up though, right? Like it's not inconceivable that someone spending $300, you could convince them to spend $600 for, something that you're going to keep for multiple years.
Yes, to some people. I think the average gamer would just hold on to their card for longer, faced with that reality.
Yeah, you say that, but then it happens generation. Like, how long are you going to hold on to that mindset for? Like, it was like the 20 series, then the 30 series, the 40 series, the 50 series, you get to the 60 series. And if you just keep grinding away and changing people's outlook on this stuff, and you get, you know what I mean? Every generation you get further down, it becomes more normalized that, well, you just want a GPU and this is how much it costs.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, NVIDIA can do that if in the face of absolutely no competition.
Which they've had to date. So,
well, yes, because again, AMD has been incompetent, but I think we saw with the B580 release, which while has been soured now by other reasons, at the launch, the announcement of the product, there was a lot of excitement for that product at that price. So I think that there's definitely demand from gamers who do not want to do that upsell. Like people are going to be like, oh yeah, I guess I have to go from owning that 3060 to now owning a 5070. Yes, if you will only buy Nvidia GPUs. But the reason why that has worked so successfully is because AMD hasn't made anything to convince gamers to not do that, and Intel hasn't really done either. And so with the B580 announcement, there was some excitement around that, so that people think, oh, maybe I don't have to do that now. And so it's really over to AMD to, I guess, do what they're claiming they are going to do, which is offer more value. But whether or not they do that, I don't know.
So let's say there was only a 7600, no 7600 XT. If AMD made a 7600 and it was pretty much the performance you see from a 7600 today, but it was introduced at an MSRP at $250 US, and it had, let's say, 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Be reasonable. I was going to say 16, but let's just say it had 12. So there was a core configuration that facilitated that. So you get roughly the equivalent performance that you're getting now from a 7600 with a minimum of 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and it costs $250 US. So $50 less, which is a huge percentage when you're comparing $250 to $300. Similar performance. Obviously, ray tracing's not there, but you get a usable amount of VRAM where you don't have to worry about texture quality settings. If Space Marines 2 comes out with a 4K texture pack, you're good to go. So how do you think that product would have sold?
From AMD?
Yeah, if that was because that's going to get glowing reviews universally, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 4060 is just a laughable product, I would say, compared to that product.
Right. So, I mean, Nvidia would still get most of the sales by far, right? Because that's just the way things are. Would it sell better than their current model? Yes. So I would expect it to sell reasonably well based on those factors. So not like they're selling 50% of the market or something.
They're not turning it around in one generation, are they?
AMD, no.
So you've got to start making steps. Yeah, you've got to start making compelling products now and do that generation on generation. And that's what they've failed to do. So you don't have to try and sell at a loss. You don't have to sell while the product I just proposed at $200 would have people scrambling, tripping over themselves to buy it, I believe. And every review would be recommending it. Everyone doing build guides. It'd be that part, right? It'd be like a Ryzen type thing where you just, the Ryzen 2700X might not be as good as the 8700K, but it's $140. Who's recommending that you spend more than twice that on the Core i7? No one. So it'd be that situation, right? But that would obviously get the ball rolling a bit quicker and move things in the right direction. But I don't even think they need to be that extreme. I think they just need to make something that is compelling, because you're sitting here going, as it turns out, what was it, $30 less? It was $270 US, so it's only $20 more than what I'm proposing here, but it had 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So you're like, it's $30 cheaper. It's got the same amount of VRAM, and even though stuff like ray tracing couldn't be any less relevant at that performance tier, it's still a factor that gets considered. There's DLSS or whatever, and again, even then upscaling on that card, if you can get it to 1440p, then it becomes pretty useful. I mean, DLSS is much better at 1080p.
Well, we'll have to see where DLSS 4 lies now, but yeah, back then that would have been the case.
Yeah, that's right. So essentially, it was not a compelling product. The Ryzen, the RX 7600 was not a compelling product. You could argue that it was better value, but it wasn't compelling.
AMD shot themselves in the foot there a little bit, because they had a ton of supply for their old cards, and so they were in this bad position where they could have they basically had to be any sort of compelling offering, write off all of that stock, which they weren't willing to do.
Which they should have done.
Which they should have done in hindsight. They should have just been like, we made too many of those, our bad, our mistake, write it all off. Let's restart and reset things. But it's pretty clear that a lot of the pricing that was set for that generation was based on them still having like a boatload of those older models and not wanting to fire sale them out the door. Or maybe they couldn't even fire sale them. I don't know.
No, they could have. The problem is, and I get it, it's the corporate world and whatnot, but it's prioritizing minimizing short-term pain and trying to maximize short-term gain. The emphasis being short-term.
Yeah.
And that's what's just been kicking them up the backside every generation. The focus is too short term. Whereas if they had of, I don't know, go back 3 generations, if they had of 3 generations made actually compelling products without bleeding badly, but just made, like I suggested there, a compelling entry level part, then I think they'd be in a much better position today. They certainly wouldn't be market leaders or dominating, but they would have a market share percentage that's worth talking about. But
yeah, and Nvidia is the company doing the long-term play. If you think about their strategy that they've executed since the 20 series with the ray tracing and RTX features and stuff, that has continued to play out and gotten more and more impressive and better each generation. So when they started with the 20 series, obviously we heavily criticized things like DLSS and ray tracing. And yeah, ray tracing, it's improved, but just DLSS, for example, has significantly improved.
DLSS is
Like
awesome.
Massively improved.
Yeah, it's really
DLSS
good.
1 was a complete joke.
It was embarrassing.
And now we're talking about DLSS 4 potentially having quality settings where they are genuinely delivering the better than native thing that they were talking about back then. And there's a lot of features where DLSS is now available. They release a new model. It's available on all those RTX cards, spanning back cards people were buying 6-7 years ago now. And so they had this long-term strategy in thinking about, hey, we want to include these AI cores and things. And maybe there's no use for them at the time. And, it wasn't worth buying a 20 series model for those things. But at some point, we're going to keep investing in that and keep actually making it worthwhile to include those hardware features. And at some point, that's going to pay off in the future, the long-term gain thing. And I think now they're seeing more of that long-term reward that they've been given by investing in those things. Whether or not we agree that all those features are amazing and worth paying for, I think gamers generally agree that they are worth paying for. So even things like ray tracing is an example. So AMD having this short-term, like very reactionary, what are we doing this one generation versus NVIDIA, it's kind of led them down this path. And that's why I'm not upset about the delay for the 9070 cards, which I know a lot of people were very upset that AMD was quote unquote botching the launch or whatever by delaying it. But like I said in the tweets that I made, it's like NVIDIA's in the dominant position. Everyone is benchmarking against NVIDIA. The only thing that matters is how your card compares to NVIDIA. It doesn't matter how good it is compared to underwhelming RDNA 3 cards or whatever. Who cares about that? Like, you're not going to sell people on a new AMD GPU because it's better than the 7800 XT or whatever. People care about what it looks like compared to a 5070, 4070, whatever NVIDIA card they've gone with previously. So the fact that they want to assess what NVIDIA is doing so they can actually respond to it, not guess or botch it, or like maybe they'll still do all that stuff anyway. In fact, knowing their track record, they probably still will. But the things that matter for them is basically listening to all this feedback that we've been talking about in this video, where this listening and realizing the strategy NVIDIA is going with, where gamers are interested in, the things that they care about right now, and making the card for them and having all the information so that you can really target that person. Whereas you go first and you're guessing about all that stuff, guessing how good a feature like DLSS 4 will be, guessing where the price to performance for these parts ends up, guessing what reviews might say about the VRAM on a 5070, for example.
Yeah, it's not even just that, because you could argue, well, they should know the performance now. They should have a very good idea of it. They know the price. Of course, Nvidia could just make them look silly and do a relaunching and unlaunching and then relaunching of the price, couldn't they? It gives them sort of a right to respond and work out how they're going to go about that, whether they even need to bother responding. Because you release those reviews now, and every reviewer, myself included, are going to say, well, these look decent. They look pretty solid. But, we have NVIDIA's answer to these coming up in a few weeks or a month or whatever it may be. So just wait and see, and we'll compare the competing part, and then we'll let you know which one of the two parts you should buy. So you don't get this, wow, this is amazing. This is so much better than the NVIDIA part. It's like, it looks good, guys, but we are going to reserve judgment until we have the full story, and the full story is coming in 2 weeks. Whereas we didn't have that with the B580. the B580 was exceptionally good value upon launch at the claimed $250 US MSRP. And we knew parts that were probably not even going to get down to that price anyway, but the competing parts were probably 6 months away. So
Yeah.
we don't say, well, this is out now, but wait 6 months because maybe there'll be a part that competes with this. If it's a month away and you're pretty concrete on it, then fair enough. But if it's projected to be much more than that, then that changes how the reviews go. But for me, that's kind of the big one. They want Nvidia to go and do what they're going to do, and then they want to crush it. They want to make it look silly like a week later with a product that's significantly better value. And that's not what they've done. So people have seen them wait, and then they've launched their very mediocre, underwhelming response. That's just not going to work. You can't have Nvidia go release their product and people be like, oh yeah, this is okay, this is decent, and then AMD reply and be like, well, the Nvidia part wasn't particularly great value and wasn't amazing, but it does have these advantages over AMD's part, and AMD's part's like a teeny tiny bit better in terms of cost per frame, so you might as well just ignore it and just go with the Nvidia part to get the better features. They've really got to...
AMD should not bother releasing Radeon cards if they're going to pull out that strategy again. Like, why
they can't do it again.
Why bother make the cards? Just don't bother. Just be like, we're not making GPUs anymore. If you're going to fail again, there's just no point. So I think part of the issue with the previous AMD generations was that they overestimated the quality of their own products. They just thought they were better than they were. It's like, remember when they were talking about the pricing of the 7900 XT versus the 7900 XTX, and they were trying to justify why the card was only $100 cheaper, even though the performance was like worse than the margin in the price. And they were like, I think this card's going to sell. Like, it's a great product. What are you talking about? And you were saying things like, yeah, but it's like whatever it was, 12% cheaper, but 20% slower. So it makes absolutely no sense. And then they repeated that strategy with a few more cards. So it's like, I think they just thought they were better than they were. Yeah, and they got a reality check from the consumers and reviews based on that.
To support that, weren't they saying it was 40% faster than a 6950 XT? I forget
Yeah, they claimed the 7900 XTX was like 70% faster than the 6950 XT, but it was, in reality, it was like not even close to that or something. It was like,
was it closer to 40? I forget the percentages. I just know they made a much... they made a claim that didn't align with the reality of the situation, which was bizarre. I guess part of it can just be, well, it's marketing and they always lie and speak BS. But at the same time, it's something they've set an expectation and it's going to be verified. So it was weird. But I get that, they did that with more recently with the original Zen 5 release, where they claimed, all these gains for games and whatnot and IPC improvements, and it turned out to be slower in some instances. And then there was that whole kerfuffle, which, we don't need to get into again because that was quite recent. But yeah, that does speak to what you're saying. They seem to overestimate what their products are capable of, or not understand their true performance. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that it's just AMD that either lies or gets it wrong, because we're constantly accused. Well, we're constantly pulling Nvidia up for doing the exact same thing.
I have some things to talk about that later when it comes to the multi-frame gen stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to AMD also assessing their features as being potentially a bit better than they really are. Things like their driver-based frame generation, which I don't believe, and I don't think most gamers believe, really adds all that much value to the product. And things like that, maybe not understanding the gap between FSR and DLSS to be where it is, and that sort of thing, which obviously plays into the discussions here, and maybe underestimating the general consumers' feelings around ray tracing. Maybe they think it's a bit more important than AMD believes it to be. So just those sorts of things, I think, hurt them. And the whole strategy of pricing it slightly below, I think, stems from that. So it'd be interesting to see where those sorts of things end up with this current generation, because based on the 5090, and what we've seen from the hardware of the other parts, there's some opportunities that are going to be here for other products to come in and offer something that's a bit more compelling to gamers. Um, because I mean, I'll be interested to see where the margins compare for some of these upcoming models compared to, say, a 30 series card, which I think is probably going to be the upgrade point for a lot of people. But if it's not particularly favorable, then there'll be an opportunity there. I was also quite surprised how underwhelming the ray tracing performance improvements were. Nvidia's been claiming things like, oh, we're reaching the limits of rasterization. Our focus now is in things like ray tracing and AI. Except, the 5090 isn't even that much faster than the 4090 for heavy ray tracing workloads. Like, it scales pretty similarly to the rasterization gains. So certainly not the 50% sort of margins that some people are expecting for ray tracing. So that was disappointing for a card where a lot of people were probably going to be thinking of using it for, say, path trace games or something like that. So that was underwhelming. I want to know from you as well, before I start talking about multi-frame generation, what is your prediction for how much a 5090 will actually cost? Because I think $2,000 is going to be not accurate for the majority of people wanting to buy 5090. So how much is a consumer actually going to need to spend on this?
I'm not even sure how long it's going to be before you can buy one, like just the point where they're readily available. I don't know how to call that. I honestly don't know what the true demand looks like. I know the true supply is very bad.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that's a situation that has been created by Nvidia in case they end up with like a 4080 situation where the reviews were underwhelming. People weren't that impressed with them. And so if they release a heap of them initially and then retailers, like to release information where, well, these things aren't really selling. We sold a few initially and now they're just sitting on shelves, which is what happened with the 4080. So,
and this sat on shelves for months and months, is my
yeah.
understanding, like
So
many months.
I think as they initially went for sale, there was a bit of the early adopter hype, or the people who were going to buy an Nvidia card no matter what. They sort of jumped in and it looked, initial sales and initial demand looked promising, and then it just fell off a cliff. So once the I don't know, let's just say the fans snapped up their cards, that was it. So I think they're trying to avoid that with the 5090. So they've released enough that they're probably confident will sell, and then they'll hear reports of cards selling out, and it's really popular, and there'll be new shipments incoming. And I think they're probably going to drip feed the market for a while to avoid that situation where there's just 5090 sitting at retailers that they can't sell.
I think that'll apply more to the 5080 as well. The 5090, I expect demand would be, just because it's a Halo product, probably pretty good, especially for workstation. There's going to be a lot of workstation demand for the 32 gig aspect, the AI aspect. I think for 5080s, that will definitely be the case.
So I think that's going to be the case for at least the first few months. I mean, the leaked pricing we've seen anywhere from $2,400 to $2,800. I think that's pretty much going to be it. You're going to be paying over $2,000 for sure for the vast majority of models. And I think availability is going to be tough.
Yeah, I think we're going to be bringing back some GPU price tracking throughout this year, just so that we've got an accurate idea of the true MSRPs for these cards. Because while I'm not overly concerned, if a $2,000 GPU ends up being $2,500, doesn't really change the picture all that much. But for things like a 5080, I think the value is going to be very different if the card is, say, $1,000 versus even just $1,200. If the true price of a 5080 is $1,200, then that's going to be very important to know for upcoming reviews of other products and that sort of thing. So we'll try to track that over this year and see how long it takes for cards to actually hit that. Whether or not they ever do, I'm not sure. For the 40 series, most cards were available at the MSRP for pretty much most of the lifespan, with the exception of the 4090. Pretty much every other card the MSRP was accurate. So we'll see whether that's true for the 50 series, but it's always hard with the sort of early stuff, isn't it? Where we hear sort of whispers about availability and pricing and that sort of thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's what we will see in 2 or 3 months. So yeah. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit and get your thoughts as well, because you probably would have seen my video now, is obviously multi-frame generation, which is the potential value add for the 50 series. So I've been talking about the disappointing price. If multi-frame generation was incredible, maybe the prices would have been justified, but it is just more frame generation. So there's that. But the thing I wanted to talk about in this podcast that I didn't really get too deep into in the video itself was about how Nvidia has forced these videos and has forced the discussion around frame generation over the last few years to be negative. I think their marketing strategy has meant that we can't be as positive about frame generation as we theoretically could be. I say that because, right, the feature itself, frame generation, is fine. Like there's nothing wrong with frame generation. It has strengths that it can improve the gaming experience. It can make games smoother, more enjoyable to play in that sense. It can solve things where, like, previously you'd use motion blur for smoothing out a game. Now you can use a much, much better version of motion blur that doesn't smear the presentation. You know, it's got advantages for high refresh rate monitors and motion clarity. There are genuine advantages to this technology where if that was the only thing that we had to talk about, right, we would make a very different video. We'd be talking about, hey, yeah, like if you've bought one of these high refresh rate monitors and you've got you meet all these different things, great feature, turn it on, you're going to get a great experience. But what we have to spend a lot of these videos doing, and what a lot of people spend time talking about, is how NVIDIA claims that it's a performance improving feature and it's not a performance improving feature. So we have to spend a whole bunch of time saying, like, NVIDIA claims this, not true. So we have to talk about that. We have to talk about things like they say the GPU's 2x or 4x the performance because of frame gen. That's misleading. It emits a whole bunch of stuff, and it starts having this more and more negative tone as you have to go through and keep debunking all of these misleading claims. And that's where I think things like fake frames come about, because NVIDIA claims they're equivalent to quote unquote real frames. So now people are talking about fake frames. And I think that's a mistake.
Mhm.
I think that the discussion around frame generation and its usefulness would be very, very different if it was advertised the way, like in the way that it improves the gaming experience. We'd be sitting here talking about it in a very different manner. But there seems to be this sort of, like, I don't know whether I've been forced into it or whether you kind of have to talk about these things, right? Like you can't just talk about the positives and ignore the way that NVIDIA's marketed it. And it just makes these videos where I'm sitting there going like, yeah, like I'd love to talk about the benefits of this, but I have to spend 10 minutes talking about how the latency is impacting it compared to what NVIDIA is saying, how the quality of it is impacting it compared to what NVIDIA is saying. So I don't know. I just feel like, I don't know whether that was a misstep, whether that was they've actually sold more GPUs because they've done this, but there was a path to have a positive, generally positive frame generation discussion that just hasn't happened because of the way that it's been marketed. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, I completely agree. We've seen this from day one with stuff like ray tracing and DLSS. And I think if you don't do what we've done and point out the misleading marketing, which we do, whether it's Intel, AMD, or NVIDIA, you're more of an influencer then when you only focus on the tech and say how great it is and the potential for it and all that. I feel like that becomes more influencer stuff. Like if NVIDIA paid you, for example, which we don't accept money from NVIDIA, AMD, or Intel, and we don't do sponsored content, but if they paid you to do a frame generation piece to promote the 50 series, all you would do is focus on how the technology works and what it offers and the benefits of it, and you would ignore obviously all the false claims because they wouldn't allow that to be in a sponsored video. So in my opinion, if you ignore all of that stuff, if you ignore where they said that a 5070 will be as faster than a 4090, then it becomes more of a sponsored content piece where you're doing more of a tech demo. And yes, obviously that's not what we do. So I totally agree. But it does put us in this annoying, awkward position where some viewers, I've seen the comments where, Harbor Unboxed, of course, they're criticizing this technology or whatever. It's like, well, we're not really necessarily criticizing the technology. We're just showing you what it can and can't be used for, because we've had to do that because false claims have been made by the first party about what the technology can do. And people are wondering, can the technology do that? So we've got to, go out of our way to actually address that and show that no, actually, it can't make a 5070 genuinely faster than a 4090. That's not a thing that can happen. And again, same thing happened with DLSS when it was first introduced, and it was very bad. Same thing happened with ray tracing when it was first introduced, and it was very bad. To NVIDIA's credit, they've made both of those things much better. And I'm sure frame generate, and this is the other frustrating thing with this, which is sort of unrelated to what we're talking about, but it's a thing that happens. It's almost inevitable at some point in time, frame generation will address these things, and actually it'll be a true performance enhancing feature. Do you believe that'll be the case?
Well, there's certainly paths with, warping technology and stuff that, there are angles that you could improve latency. So yeah, I'm sure at some point that is going to happen.
I think what we can say is, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the technology will improve.
The visual quality angle for sure. Like, I've no doubt that will improve over time.
Yeah. So we'll get to a future where the technology either addresses the things that we said it isn't doing right now, whatever, and then we'll get, mostly people who sort of visit r/NVIDIA Reddit, let's say, but they'll be like, oh, this technology Tim used to slam or Harbor Box used to slam, and look, it does all of these things, which is what we saw with DLSS. When DLSS was a blurry mess and it was terrible and didn't deliver on any of the better than native promises and things that Jensen made for the Turing generation. And now it's genuinely good. And since it became genuinely good, we've said it's genuinely good, but you still see a lot of those comments where, we needlessly bash DLSS and all that sort of stuff. So I'm sure we'll see that again with frame generation when it actually does what they're claiming, it does, if that does happen to occur in the future. But yeah, basically we have to waste a lot of time and energy appearing like we don't like technologies like frame generation, even though, we think they're perfectly fine. They're not, I was going to say they're not harmful, but then I thought twice and I was like, well, they're not harmful in the sense that it's nice to have a good quality frame generation support on your GPU, whether or not it applies to the type of gaming you have or whether you want to use it. But they become harmful when marketing departments weaponize them to do exactly what we've said they've done by claiming things that just, they're not true.
I think it's worse than, well, the situation with first generation DLSS was a little different in the sense that it was marketed in a way and that was incorrect, and also the feature was bad. So like you just wouldn't use it. There wasn't a situation where I'd be like, please go out and use DLSS. The marketing claims are wrong for XYZ reason, but there's still reason to use this. With DLSS 1, it was pretty much just a universal not good. With the issue I have with frame gen and these videos, and the feeling that I get making these videos, is that I watch the conclusion and I mention all the stuff, the marketing, whatever, and I talk about where it's useful and not useful. And I feel like I've made like a neutral to negative video. Like it's pretty straight down the line, tending towards, some issues with it, that sort of thing. But my opinion, removing all the marketing BS discussion, is that there's nothing wrong with the technology. And there's reasons I would use it. There's configurations I would recommend people turn on frame generation, turn on multi-frame generation. There are reasons to use the tech, and yet in the video it's clouded by all this other stuff. And so when I'm making these, it's very frustrating as a creator to make a video like that, where, like if I made a video being like, I love frame generation, I think it's great, like there's strengths and benefits to it, but I'm ignoring all that other stuff, the downsides, the marketing. Again, I've just made an influencer video, as you've said, but then it's kind of like my true thoughts on frame generation as a technology are sort of being suppressed by, you know what I mean? Like, I sort of sit here at the end of the day and I'm like, if someone's like, should I use frame generation? I'm not going to be like, no, never use it. I'll be like, well, if you've got X, Y, Z, like it can be good.
There's qualifiers, but that's just objective. That's just proper testing. Like for example, if I came to you, I said, I mostly play competitive shooters. I like to minimize my latency. That's the pretty much the only reason I shoot for high frame rates. The smoothness is like, that's an added benefit of it. But primarily I'm after the improved input latency. Should I use frame generation?
Well, it doesn't improve latency. In fact, it reduces latency, so you wouldn't use it.
So there's a huge percentage of gamers that couldn't be any less interested in frame generation. Like, it's for them, from my perspective, it is a bad technology, right? It's something that I would never entertain using. Is
it bad, or is it just something you wouldn't use?
Well, yeah, I'm saying bad in the sense that if I turn it on, my experience is worse. It's bad, right?
Yeah.
So therefore, it's a bad technology from my narrow point of view, right? Which certainly applies to other gamers who, for example, if we go back in the day when I first got into computing, and this is sort of why I have this mindset, because, well, first of all, it's still the type of games I play, the fast-paced, Twitch-based sort of games. But, back in the day, Quake. I played a lot of Quake, Rocket Arena, all that sort of stuff. And I remember there was like the Quake time demos and stuff. We were always shooting for higher FPS. And back then, there was like VSync off, massive tearing, all that kind of crap we used to have to deal with. Smoothness and all that sort of stuff wasn't really a factor. It wasn't something. It was improving your input latency and getting the most up-to-date frame, or at least as most of that frame as you could get. And that's sort of still what it is today with games like, Apex Legends, Fortnite, Valorant, so on and so forth, Marvel Rivals, all those sort of games. You really want to prioritize that, or at least a lot of the more competitive gamers do. But I think by and large, gamers who play fast-paced shooters want that. And the smoothness thing, I mean, that's sort of taken care of itself, really, hasn't it, with high refresh rate monitors? So it's not something you associate with a graphics card technology. It's more the graphics card just has to pump out X amount of frames. So yeah, from that point of view, it's a useless technology. And like DLSS in general is a bit like that, and so is ray tracing. But then, VRAM becomes a lot less important as well. So it depends on who you're reviewing the card for. But even for those where frame generation can be a benefit, there's still several qualifiers.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as, if you play these games, you absolutely want to use it, and if you play these games, you absolutely don't want to use it. It's more of a situation, if you play these games, you absolutely don't want to use it, and if you play these games, you may want to use it.
I think that's a generally reasonable summary of when you'd use the technology. It would just be much more enjoyable to make that sort of video where that would be the only thing that we really have to say. We wouldn't have to then go and do all the other stuff, I guess.
It's doubling down on the negatives, essentially. So you would have to be objective and be honest and give a true, honest assessment of the technology. You'd have to say essentially what I just said. These type of gamers don't want to use it. These type of gamers may want to use it. Now, the type of gamers that may want to use it would have to meet these certain criteria for it to be a useful technology. If you fit that criteria more often than not, then this is probably going to be a beneficial technology to you. End of story. But then when you get to the bad, you go and describe what I just described, where isn't terribly useful or may not be of use at all. And then you have to add the double negative of, and also, here's Nvidia's BS, and they've said this, which isn't true, and this just proves, and you get that, which very much upsets the pro Nvidia people, that undertone of, and here's why, the Nvidia marketing's BS because of what we're seeing here with the increased latency. And it just makes it seem like you're much more negative and against the technology because you're having to do that the whole way through the video. So I think that's basically what you're saying. You can't just...
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's doubling up on the negatives because the marketing stuff is not actually relevant to the experience, right? Like you're not sitting there playing a game being like, all that like I'm testing the marketing here. You're just playing the game. You're just playing the game.
That's where I get really annoyed, though. I do understand where they're coming from. People are like, well, you should just ignore that, Tim, because that's not about the product. You should ignore the marketing when you're evaluating the product and just focus on the product. But it's like, come on. You can't have Jensen on stage telling, like, how many tweets and how many, all the people that were losing their minds going, oh my God, Hammerbox, how excited are you? The 4090 is now obsolete. The 5070 is going to be faster. This is like, people took that hook, line, and sinker. They were running with it. Like, it becomes then a massive talking point of the product. And you can't evaluate the technology while completely ignoring the reason why people are interested in the technology to begin with. I get where they're coming from, but at the same time, it's like, no, you can't make you like, millions of people watch that as well. Millions of gamers. You can't make those claims and then have them not addressed. Like, as soon as they say that then becomes the focal point. They set the narrative, and that's what you're saying. You wish they didn't do that.
Yeah, I wish they didn't do that so I could just talk about what the technology does. And yeah, I find Nvidia's marketing on that a little, like, I was going to say I find it unusual, but I don't find it unusual because I know exactly why they do it. It's obvious why they do it. It's to sell graphics cards. That's what marketing is. And, I had a discussion with them at CES about those marketing slides, and they, basically said, well, we believe, the technology, it's representative of the technology that the cards are capable of doing, right? Like, we believe that, you would play with multi-frame generation enabled and all that sort of stuff. And, that fair enough. That's their opinion. I just find that very, I guess there's a disconnect there because NVIDIA also has features like Reflex and Reflex 2, which was announced at CES, where they make latency quite a focus of gaming, especially for competitive games, where they say things like, well, you're better at gaming if you have a high refresh rate monitor playing games with Reflex on it or low latency. And so to have that being sort of a focus of performance for that sort of thing, but then ignoring that when talking about the frame generation output, when talking about the FPS performance of GPUs or whatever, I find that you can't really, like, logically have those two positions. It's either latency is important for performance, and therefore you always have to talk about that when discussing performance, whether that's for competitive games lowering latency or for single player games improving the frame rate to lower latency, or it's not important, in which case then you can make claims like, we believe this delivers twice the performance or experience for single player gaming, but also Reflex then becomes irrelevant for multiplayer games because latency is not important. So NVIDIA's they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, like they've got these two positions that they're constantly talking about, yet they're perfectly willing to omit whatever things about the performance and experience that they're not really wanting to talk about when they're doing that specific marketing. So yes, I find that a little frustrating. But again, I'm not surprised they're doing that. Like, I understand why they're marketing cards that way, is because, as you talked about with the tweets and things we saw when they made that claim about the 5070, it's very effective. Like, that slide was one of the most effective marketing slides in the presentation. It's just misleading.
Yeah, and they don't care that AMD can do it as well. They basically see AMD as being irrelevant, which, as we've discussed, kind of fair enough position to have. They want to use it to sell GeForce GPU owners on new GeForce GPUs. So there's no real concern there that AMD is going to turn around and do the same thing, because that's of no concern.
I actually asked them about that at CES. I asked them a question along the lines of, are you concerned that with your marketing, you're sort of not, you're not comparing apples to apples anymore. You're accepting that we're making comparisons between different technologies on and off. You're setting the tone with this, NVIDIA. Your competitors are going to start doing this too, and AMD is already doing this with things like driver-based frame generation, their own, upscaling technologies, which may not be the same quality. How do you feel about setting the tone with this and then having competitors potentially doing even more of this in an even worse way? And their answer was basically, that's on reviewers to solve. So they basically said, well, that's on you guys to, as in us, Hardware Unboxed, to sort out whether, they're making claims and it's accurate for the experience, whatever. It's like, okay, well, please don't get upset then when we criticize your marketing too, because
the truth is, if they had have told the truth, they'd be up that famous creek without a paddle. Imagine if Jensen came out on that stage and was like, all right, gamers, you're paying 25% more for about 25% more performance with the 5090. It's going to use about 30% more power. That's kind of what we're offering here at the high end, 25 or 30% performance bump for 25% more money. But it's probably going to be, that's MSRP money. So, it could be different than that, but that's what we're promising. And then the rest of the product range, I don't know, you're looking at a 10, 15, 20% performance uplift for similar money. Imagine if they came out more honest about what was actually going to happen with the GeForce 50 series.
Well,
they can't do that. So they just come out and they're like, yeah, it's we've got multi-frame generation. It's like twice as quick. It's 3 times faster. We're making up numbers now. How cool does that sound? And then people lose their minds like they did. So it worked. But they know they can't tell the truth. They can't come out.
You're saying they can't tell the truth. Like, the strategy that they went with was obviously the most effective strategy.
Yeah.
There is a strategy, like there are positive aspects to the things that they had to announce at CES that could have meant that they weren't as misleading with some of their marketing. For example, they really didn't talk too much about the improvements they'd made to things like DLSS 4, upscaling, ray reconstruction, that sort of thing. I guess because it's available on your previous generation products.
Yeah.
But that was a thing, an obvious angle that you could use to get people hyped about being in the NVIDIA GPU ecosystem. And you could talk about, the 5090's real performance, and the pricing probably would have made people a little underwhelmed about the products, but you don't even have to talk about the performance of a card like a 5070. You just say, we're making a 5070 and it's $550. Learn more about that later. And people will probably be like, $550 is not that bad of a price. I think the 5080 at $1,000, a lot of people were expecting pre-launch that it was going to be like $1,300, $1,400. Maybe that's the real price when you buy an AIB card. But you didn't even have to say what the performance was. You just be like, we're making a 5080, it's $1,000. It's half the price of the 5090. We're going to be providing great technology at that price.
Yeah, well, obviously, I'd advocate for them being honest or more honest on doing that. I'm just saying, you can see why they didn't do that.
No, their strategy was more effective. I don't believe that there wasn't an alternative world where they could be more honest with products and have it work. Like, they definitely could be.
I mean, I don't agree with you. I don't disagree with you. I don't disagree, but at the same time, they did what they did, and then closer to launch, it became apparent that it was only going to be about 25. I think people estimated pretty accurately 27%, which is what we got. And then you saw the videos start coming out, disappointing, embarrassing performance uplift and stuff, because people were expecting 40% minimum or whatever.
So I shouldn't believe leaks. Another reminder of that.
Yep. And then the tone online shifted a lot. And you saw people produce, and then our reviews launched and confirmed that, it was what people had recently calculated it to be. And I think overall the community reception has been pretty negative overall, I would say. Is that the sense you got?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's fair for the 5090. I think there's still a bit of tempering of expectations for the other models. There's sort of like, well, the 5090 was this, but there's still going to be some wait and see for the other cards, but we'll see how that goes.
There's not really. You just have to look at the specs. You already know. But anyway, I mean, I haven't reviewed them. Obviously I don't have a 5070 yet, but I know what the specs are. You know what the specs are. Yeah.
Right. Anything else to say about the 5090 before we move on and talk about some other things?
No, I think just in summary, I think the 5090 is a great product. Yeah, it's quite power hungry and it's pushing things more towards the limits, but my experience using the product has been pretty awesome. Like, it's a fantastically powerful GPU. It's a great product. It's really a fantastic product to game with. There's no better experience. It's the ultimate. Just what's disappointing about it is obviously the price, probably availability, and just the fact that, if availability is good or was going to be good, that Nvidia could have genuinely made an exciting product despite, the node limitations and stuff like that. But They clearly don't feel
Mhm.
like they don't need to, and maybe they don't need to. So
Well, and the node limitations are irrelevant for all the other products. It matters for the top tier product, but all the other products are lower configurations that they could just adjust if they really wanted to. Makes it a bit more expensive, I guess, but
yeah. So yeah, I mean, I say the product's disappointing because of all factors. I still believe the product itself to be very good. It's just
mhm,
obviously the price that's not very good. Um, so that's that
yeah.
really.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be harder to extract significant generational gains that we have previously seen from products like a 4090 versus 3090. I think as we start moving into upcoming generations beyond the 50 series, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to see gains in that sort of 50% range from like the best
Yeah.
performing cards to the best
Yep.
performing cards. They've already they're up to 575 watts now on a huge die. Like you're not going to be
Hmm.
seeing a 50% performance per watt improvement from a single node shrink for the next
Hmm.
node. Like that's just not happening.
Hmm.
So whether or not like maybe they could improve the architecture and other aspects of the product, but the fact that they're now willing to go as high as 575 watts, there's you can't keep scaling the power forever. So,
You say that, and then there's an 800-watt model.
well, yeah, I'm not saying they couldn't do like they could definitely do an 800-watt model and things like that, but 800 watts compared to 600 watts is only what like 30% more.
Yeah, it's just more power, more
It's,
performance.
it's not that. It's not 50% more. It's not like going from what 450 watts versus 300 watts is a 50% improvement in the power spec, and that's sort of
Hmm.
what we were getting with like the 4090 series. So
Yeah, you start to run into the situation that we're already seeing as well, where it's actually really hard to feed that GPU
yeah.
because I guess it's a less efficient design.
Hmm.
So you need massive, like just when 8K gaming becomes relevant, even though you're not doing it at frame rates that are acceptable, but that's where you're actually seeing the true scaling of or you're getting the most out of the GPU. It's able to scale to its full potential relative to the products under it. Anyway,
Yeah, and I think that's going to be more true if things like DLSS performance mode is as good as some of the early previews that we've seen from it. And
mhm.
I had a look at it. CS looks really good. So obviously, the performance mode means you're rendering in an even lower resolution. So that again is going to make it harder to feed such a large GPU core. If it turns out that we recommend the performance mode, for example, yeah, it's going to be how do you feed that massive 5090 and get it up to those significant performance gains? Yeah, you're talking about ultra ray tracing sort of things there for sure.
Mhm.
So yeah, any other final thoughts about the 5090? Otherwise, we'll just talk about some boring life.
Just buy it.
All right, we're back, Steve. What's been happening? You've just said you've been buying a whole bunch of 5090s. So,
No, I get them for free. I'm a YouTuber, Tim.
oh, that's right. How many have you got at the moment? Just the two?
I've got 3 at the moment, but I've got about 3 or 4 more incoming.
Okay.
So, yep, impressive paperweights. No. I'll be doing AIB reviews on all of them. I've got the Liquid Supreme to do next,
Yeah.
but there'll be some 5080 cards before that because obviously they're coming
Yeah. Yeah.
shortly. So I'll have to. There'll be the day one Nvidia Founders Edition review, and then there'll be an AIB card review, which is going to be another MSI card because that's the only 5080 I have. Um, so yeah, the supply on those were really tight, basically. So that's why hardly any reviewers have got them or got them out in time. MSI privately couriered the card to me to get it in time so we could do it. And we're just lucky that the MSI team is in Victoria. So yeah, that worked out well. But yeah, other than just benchmark updates, and I've been continuing to do that because there was a few things like 4K ray tracing with upscaling that wasn't in our initial review. That'll be in the 5080 review. So I've been working on updating more, adding more cards. I've gone back and added some GeForce 30 series cards because a few people were disappointed that wasn't there, which totally agree with. It's more just a time thing. So I've had another essentially week up my sleeve to add a few more cards because it does take quite a long time, almost a day, to benchmark a single card because you've got to add it to the 17 games and then the 6 game ray tracing and then do power stuff and yeah, there's quite a bit involved there. Many hours of testing just to add a single card, which I don't think some people fully appreciate or understand, that, testing one graphics card and what amounts to about 25 games at 3 resolutions, just how long that takes. Yeah, it's quite a timely process. So
Luckily, all the models are coming at it roughly the same time with both AMD and Nvidia, so you can do all that stuff once, and then hopefully it will last for
the comparative. Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, some of the older, more traditional websites carry over data for a longer period of time, which is generally okay, depending on, and that's why they often use older games as well, because Shadow of the Tomb Raider, for example, performance hasn't changed there for many years. But we try to add new games. So we've got the new Star Wars games, Space Marine 2, a few others, Stalker 2, for example. So you generally, like, the Stalker 2 data may have to be updated. Certainly would almost certainly have to be updated in 6 months from now, I would say. So basically through all the data out, the whole lot, whether it's a game that we've carried over for quite a while, and we just latest drivers, 9800X 3D, latest BIOS, all that sort of stuff, and just retest everything. And as I said, it's about a day per card. And I think we've got in total, I've done about 20 cards. So you're looking at roughly 20 days of doing nothing but GPU benchmarking. And of course, we have other things I have to do during that time. So yeah, I started just over a month ago, which is why I haven't got 30 series. And the 4K ray tracing data was a bit of an oversight on my behalf, because, and I think a few people misunderstood what I was saying in my review. Previously, we haven't done 4K ray tracing benchmarks because the performance on existing products has been so bad. Like, it's something you can really only hope to maybe achieve on a 4090. And even then, the 4090, I think, with DLSS quality upscaling, like Black Myth Wukong, for example, at 4K, you're looking at maybe 40 FPS. Alan Wake 2, I think you're in the 30 FPS range. So a lot of these games where you have done the testing and said that ray tracing is truly transformative in these select titles, at 4K, the performance is abysmal. So we're not trying to show 4K in the worst possible. We're not trying to show ray tracing performance in the worst possible light at 4K, where most GPUs can't do it, and conclude that 4K is unusable. We thought 1440p with quality upscaling is probably a reasonable use case scenario where most people are sort of doing ray tracing, would make sense. So I just didn't waste time benchmarking cards at 16 frames per second at 4K. But with the 5090, certainly 4K quality upscaling ray tracing becomes more relevant. You're looking at like 60 FPS in Alan Wake 2 and Black Myth Wukong, which is perfectly playable performance, but there's no way I'm paying $2,000 or more for a GPU to play at 60 FPS. That, I know I'm a bit of an FPS snob, but I think that's a pretty low bar. I don't know. What about you? You're the single player expert over here, Tim. So what would you be playing Black Myth Wukong and Alan Wake 2 at? What's your acceptable frame rate?
Right. So,
well, probably less Alan Wake 2. Let's go Black Myth Wukong.
I guess like what I would personally configure it at is, I would lower the quality settings and target something around that 90 FPS, 90 to 100 FPS range.
Definitely.
How I've actually been playing those games, I find myself these days more almost playing games and evaluating them at the same time. So often I'm just cranking everything up using all the NVIDIA tech just so that I get a good feel for what the tech, like what is the actual experience, for example, playing Black Myth Wukong on the ultra ray tracing settings with DLSS and frame generation, everything enabled. Like, is that a good experience? And if it turns out I'm playing the game at 30 FPS or whatever, then so be it. And I'll just play it and see what it's like. And then maybe halfway through the game, I'll be like, I've really had enough of that. And then I'll turn it down.
That sounds bad.
But so how I actually play them now is sort of a little different to what I would, how I've used to play games. But if I was optimizing games, the experiences that I've always found the best has been, sort of around that 90 to 100 FPS, 80, like Alan Wake 2 is fine at 60 FPS.
Yeah. It's like Microsoft Flight Simulator.
Yeah, Microsoft Flight Simulator, you can play at like 40 FPS because you're not doing anything. especially with like 40 FPS with frame gen in Flight Simulator is perfectly fine because you actually probably want a bit more smoothness, but the input latency is completely irrelevant.
Yeah,
So
totally
yeah,
agree.
that's sort of been my experience, and that plays into the frame gen discussion as well. When I talk about like minimum frame rates and those sorts of things for good experiences, yeah, that's just based on that. So
yeah, so essentially with the 5090 it becomes a bit more relevant. So I guess you could say an oversight there on my behalf, but also it's just like I can only do so much testing. But the good news is I've gone back and I've included that data, which will be featured in the 5080 content. But I also pinned a comment, and basically, despite all the accusations and slandering and stuff that went on a place like Reddit because we didn't include 4K ray tracing, despite the fact that we did technically include 4K ray tracing because the 17 game average was based on our 4K data. So all 17 games there were tested at 4K. And what do you got? You got Dragon Age the Vanguard and Star Wars Outlaws. At least those two titles have some form of ray tracing enabled by default, especially with the ultra quality preset. So you got those margins there. And also the takeaway from the 17 game average was 27% on average uplift for the 5090 over the 4090. And then with ray tracing, it's 26%. So it's not like we were hiding anything. And I always find it interesting when you get accused of being like, I don't know, shills for company that they don't like or whatever, because you hid these benchmarks despite showing a different set of benchmarks to show the same thing. And I'm like, okay, all right, I hear. It would have been nice to include that data. But what is it that we're hiding? Like, what is that data revealing? Like, did we run the 4K benchmarks and be like, oh, gee, the 5090 looks good here. It's 50% faster. Let's just delete that. We want to stick with the 27% narrative. Like, everyone who did 4K ray tracing benchmarking found the same margins as they did with rasterization. So I don't know what the big conspiracy is here. Like, it's weird, is it not? Like, if you're going to accuse someone of doing that, you have to be like, you did this and here is the reason why, even though that may not even be necessarily true, but at least you have some sort of supporting evidence that the card's
like
much better.
Other people found maybe in like Indiana Jones, it was like 50% faster, which no one found, by the way. They did not find that.
Even one title, you can't, because there's always outliers. It's like, because otherwise, if we were,
AMD
fans,
Reddit, those places, they would point to like one or two titles, but there's not even that. There's not even one or two titles where really you're seeing mind-blowing gains of that level for ray tracing at 4K.
I know this is meant to be boring live stuff, but another thing that sort of annoyed me because the nuance just goes out the window, and maybe it's just a lack of understanding or ability to process this. But so when we test CPUs, right, and we're all for testing unrealistic situations. So using a 4090 or now it'll be a 5090 at 1080p to remove that component. So that's not the way you would play the game, typically speaking, but it shows you the true CPU performance. And so we agree that's the best test method, and that's really how things should be done. And we've gone in, so we've gone into depth about that. Now, that was sort of thrown in our face in a lot of these Reddit threads saying how biased we are or yada, yada, yada. And this really exposes our bias because we're all for testing that way. But then when it comes to GPUs, we're testing with, upscaling at 1440p, which may create maybe a CPU bottleneck, which in a lot of instances is actually not. It's just that the 5090 just doesn't scale that well. But basically saying that there's a disconnect there between how we test the CPUs to show the 9800X3D to be the fastest, even though we did the same test method when Intel was faster, but okay. And then we're not doing that. We're not testing it like 4K without upscaling with ray tracing enabled, or we're not testing at 8K. We're not, or we're not using, some sort of resolution scaling, let's say like super resolution scaling to really increase the workload to show, because when you do that, you can see more often than not like 40 to 50% margins favoring the 5090. But the problem with that is it is a complete inverse to what we're doing with the CPUs, because the GPU isn't becoming more powerful throughout time. With the CPU situation, the CPU's not becoming more powerful either, but it's being utilized more. So games become more CPU demanding over time, and therefore the actual true margins we're showing you now become the margins. Whereas with GPUs, while that will be somewhat true, the frame, if you have to run the 5090 at 40 FPS and the 4090 at say 30 FPS to show that margin, that's the FPS. So unless you're happy gaming at 40 FPS, it's never consistently going to be that much faster than a 4090. So you're not going to see that at high frame rates, for example, because the GPU is not becoming more powerful over time. You get 2 years down the track and games are significantly more demanding. And whereas the 5090, I think it averaged 137 FPS at 4K, it's not going to be rendering 140 FPS in a game 3 years down the track with all the latest and greatest quality settings enabled. It's going to be down to around 60 FPS. So while you might be seeing, and that's what I said in my conclusion, I expect the 5090 to age better relative to the 4090, but that doesn't mean it's a better value buy right now, because by the time that's realized, the performance is going to be so bad that you're going to want the 6090 or the 7090 or whatever it may be. So if I explain that well, does that make sense?
Yeah, basically you're saying over time, a GPU performance may go from 120 FPS in modern games get more demanding, they're now rendering at 60 FPS. Whereas a CPU, it may be rendering 60 FPS now because you're mostly GPU limited, but then over time, it may have to start rendering 120 or 130 FPS because, again, you get faster GPUs or whatever happens.
Yeah.
And so the bottleneck shifts a little bit there. Like you're basically going from GPU limited to more GPU limited, whereas on the CPU going from GPU limited to CPU limited, which is why you're testing that way.
Any seasoned gamer knows this, right? You buy a good CPU and you can have that for multiple GPU generations. But you buy a good GPU and you don't have that for multiple CPU generations.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's why there's a different, it's a different thing. But again, the logic there falls apart anyway, because the way we test CPUs has been the way I've tested CPUs for 20 plus years. And the way I test GPUs is relatively the same way for 20 plus GPUs, add in stuff like upscaling and, that's complicated things ever so slightly, and is probably going to be an absolute nightmare in the not too distant future with what we think is coming down the pipe with DLSS 4 and the upscaler. They're improving quite substantially. So that's going to be a fun time.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic that we'll have to get into at some point, is talking about that
I don't know
the
answer. Don't know the answer there yet. But yeah, we'll work that out.
That's more of we'll come to that hurdle when everything is evaluated and tested compared to FSR4. But so you've just been testing. Nothing else has been happening.
No, not entirely true. So the Harbour and Box gym is progressing very well. So I've got a lot of flooring down now, and I've started working on the roof. And I'm using C-purlins there for most of the structural stuff on the roof. So I've been welding a lot of cleats and stuff.
Nice.
So you know what a cleat is, don't you? So it's like a metal plate that you weld onto a main beam, and you can, because like C-purlins, for example, or Z-purlins, Z-purlins, depending on where you are in the world, they bolt. So if you've seen like, you might see like a massive main beam or like an H-beam, and it has tabs off it that you bolt to. They use them in like shed construction a lot and stuff like that. Anyway, it's a really good way of constructing it, like in an engineering perspective, because you're welding on this plate. You don't have to worry about the welds cracking and stuff with the way it's done. And then the purlins, the screws allow movement, right? So you've still, because if you weld it all together, especially a large structure, and you get a lot of thermal expansion and stuff, that's where over time welds will crack. So the reason they bolt a lot of that stuff is to allow slight movement without stressing the welds. And anyway, there's more to it, but that's essentially it. So that's why you construct it that way. But with the cleats, when I was doing it, and this is just a fun little story. It's not fun. They're just little metal plates that are relatively thick because they take the whole load of the beam through them and then pass that onto the main beam. And you can get them pre-drilled because it is quite thick steel, so you don't want to be drilling out all the holes, but then you've got to make sure that you get them in the perfect spot and all that. So anyway, I was going to do the pre-drilled approach, buy pre-drilled cleats. Now, they were fairly expensive because, they have to pay for the consumables to drill out the holes and all that sort of stuff. So I was tossing up doing it myself, the time involved. And in the end, it was going to be so much cheaper to drill them myself. And you've seen like things like drill presses and stuff like that.
Yep.
So in the end, I ended up buying a magnetic drill, which is really the best way to do it. Which I think it was about $2,500 for the magnetic drill. I had to drill, I think it was 260 of them, and each one has to have 2 holes in it. So it's a lot of holes, and the drill bit, I think the consumable bit's like $80 Australian. So I bought that, and basically I ended up doing it for the same price minus the time involved. But I got the drill out of it, so I can use that for future projects and whatnot.
Okay.
So that worked out quite well. And anyway, the magnetic drill drills the holes relatively quickly. Use a soluble like oil, like coolant type thing to cool the drill bit while you do it.
Cool.
And it works really well. It's kind of I don't know. I don't want to say fun, but it's like I don't know. It's not hard work to do it, and it's kind of somewhat enjoyable. Without saying fun.
Right. Yeah.
It's almost satisfying, let's say. So anyway, I didn't do all of them. We sort of, took it in turns. My father-in-law really did the most of it. He enjoyed doing that. It was a job we sort of gave him. So yeah, but anyway, that worked really well. So I've now since welded over 200 of them into place, and the floor purlins have since been attached, and we've got yellow tongue flooring down now. But we started bolting the overhead stuff up, and yeah, it's worked a treat. It's ridiculously strong. I've sort of gone mass overkill on this, as you are aware.
Well, that's the way you build stuff. So
as you're aware,
I'm not
that
surprised.
I like to do. Yep. Well, why not, Tim? Why not? You could, it's good. So yeah, my roof is structurally, I could just chuck yellow tongue flooring down on it, despite the fact that it's on an angle. But it would be strong enough to be a floor for an additional level of the building. Typically, you don't need to make roofs that strong, but that's what I've chosen to do. And I've had a lot of fun playing with my new welder with the argon gas and that. It does like the nicest welds, so much nicer than the gasless stuff. But that's been good. So I've been getting out there a little bit whenever I can and do a bit of that. Obviously, I'm going to be struggling over the next few days, but hopefully later in the week I'll be able to throw half a day at it or whatever, so we can get the Harbour Unbox gym that one step closer to being complete.
Cool.
And then I've been playing a little bit of Fortnite and stuff with my daughter and some of my mates. So I've still been gaming a bit. I haven't streamed anything. I might actually stream some Fortnite for the 5080 release night. I might look at doing that because we've been playing the reload mode and having a lot of fun. And I was telling you.
Is that a new mode? I'm not familiar with Fortnite at all.
I think they stole it or borrowed it from Call of Duty. So it's essentially a respawn mode. So the matches are shorter, the maps are smaller. There's like half as many players as the normal Battle Royale mode. But, in Battle Royale, if you get knocked and you're not rezzed or whatever, you can be rebooted, but essentially you got to wait for your team to try and pull that off. Whereas in Reload, if you're eliminated, you can just glide back in, and you can do that for a certain period of time until until the reload period ends, and then then it's like the survival based part of it for the
right. Okay,
final.
So it's kind of like a hybrid of more traditional multiplayer gaming where you just respawn whenever, and then it moves into a survival battle royale stuff.
You lose your loot, so you respawn with one basic gun that's next to useless. So you've got to try and like land before everyone kills you out of the sky, and then land on some decent loot to rearm yourself, reapply shields, and then go back into battle. So it's been a lot of fun. We've been doing really well with it. So I have been playing the ranked mode with one of my mates, and I've got to Unreal in that. I got to Unreal in the normal Battle Royale mode, which was considerably harder, mind you, much more of a grind, where it was very easy. I found a Reloaded. The Unreal division's extremely easy to reach there.
Is that the highest division?
Yeah, it's like the top 1% or something of the gamers playing Fortnite. So that's pretty good fun. It's once I get there, like in the main battle royale, I'd say I'm genuinely more of a champion level skill level, but I can grind to get to Unreal, and then once I get there, it's like I don't really belong here, but I'm here, so that's fun. But like one funny little story when we were gaming. So, as I said, the reason I play Fortnite is because of my daughter, who is now 11 and still loves her Fortnite, plays it.
Yep.
So, well, yeah, I can't believe I play Fortnite. All right, Tim. I know you like to give me grief for it, and so do some of the people listening. But I don't care anymore. Whatever. I actually genuinely enjoy it. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I can't believe I play it. There's no other way to really put it, because I came from, in the early days, I mentioned Quake, Command and Conquer. Then I went into Call of Duty, massive Call of Duty fan, played, the amount of hours I put into Call of Duty was just ridiculous. Played it with a lot of friends. And then probably leading up to Fortnite, I was playing a lot of StarCraft 2. Love StarCraft 2. Kind of hate what's happened with that game, and that, and it wasn't really continued on. But I also get it. There's probably not a huge, I was going to say fan base for real-time strategy. Anyway, I won't go into that. But then, yeah, I was playing mostly StarCraft 2 and Call of Duty at the time, and my daughter wanted me to play Fortnite anyway. Got into it, played it, and then I got hooked on the mechanical aspect of it. I know people are going to be pissed off when I say this, but I find Call of Duty, and even the new Marvel Rivals, I played a bit of that, which, it's a good game, but I just find it very simple, sort of boring, slow-paced. My brain sort of wanders when I'm doing it. Whereas with Fortnite, my brain's like almost melting, trying to keep up with. It's almost like a shooting chess game with the strategy involved and the piece control and the editing and all that. It's overwhelming, which admittedly is why I didn't like it, which I think is why most people don't like it. I just was like, no, just give me my Call of Duty. I like that, this Fortnite crap. But anyway, I'm into it and play it. But where I'm going with this story is I was playing it just the other night with my daughter and two of my mates. So there was four of us playing a squad game. And this is a very simple story, but it's funny. You sort of had to be there for it to be funny, but I'm going to tell you guys anyway because it's my boring life, and I don't have anything else to tell you. So we're playing this squad game. We'd been playing for multiple hours. It was quite late at night, and I had to go to the toilet. So we were back in the lobby. We readied up for a new game, and I ran off to go to the toilet. My daughter's come over to my computer, and I've got a Rodecaster Pro 2, like a Stream Deck type thing. And it has on part of it a voice changer board, which I never, ever, ever use. Never touch it. I don't reckon I've pushed a button and used the voice changer function in well over a year. Okay. And it's not, I don't know when it's on. That's the problem. So one of the lights lights up a bit brighter, but I'm not looking at it. So anyway, you can see where this is going. I go after the toilet. My daughter says to the boys, don't tell dad, but I'm going to put the voice changer on. And so I come back none the wiser, and I'm talking to the guys, and they're like sort of they did a really good job of not making it obvious. They're like, one of them was sort of snickering a little bit, but I didn't know what it was in relation to. And so we load into the game, and I've said to the guys, let's drop at PP. That's Pleasant Park. So I've said that, and I've said it later. So I've gone,
all right, guys, let's drop at PP.
And I look over at Zoe, and she's just red in the face because she's gaming. She's actually in the studio at the moment over school holidays. I've let her come in here. It's a big deal to her. She's loving it. I'm going to struggle to get her out of here. And I've looked over at her, and she's just losing it. And I'm like,
what's so funny, Zoe? Nothing in Fortnite can be that funny. Can you focus up?
And I look over at her, and she just has tears streaming down her face. And I'm thinking, what if I missed here? And anyway, the boys aren't saying anything. They're just like, Zoe, we can't, work on your comms. No one can hear anything that's going on. And she's just laughing and losing it. Long story short, no one said anything for the entire half an hour game. And Zoe was just laughing the whole half an hour. She got to the point where she was struggling to breathe. She's like and I just got to the point where I was annoyed with her. So I was just ignoring her. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I've missed something. You won't explain what's happening. And, so I basically put her on mute, and I'm just playing the game because I wanted to win this round. And we got to the end of the game, and the boys like, all right, Zoe, can you turn it off now? It's really annoying. And I'm like, turn off what? And then, it became apparent that she turned the voice changer on the entire game. I sound like a chipmunk. And she thought it was the funniest thing ever. I thought to myself, I'm so glad I wasn't live streaming then, because oh man, I mean, the guys in chat would have spoiled it straight away for sure. They couldn't help themselves.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the fact that I did, I couldn't believe it. I was just like, oh my god, like honestly, it was probably trolling the boys more than it was anyone else, because we're trying to communicate in the game, and Zoe is just losing her mind laughing, and the boys have to listen to me yelling at them like a chipmunk for half an hour. Anyway, so.
I'll have to figure out how my Rodecaster does all those voice changing things.
Yeah, there's like a menu and you can push across to it. Mine had it by default. So like I've got on number 1, I've got like sound effects, so I can make like chime noises and all different kinds of
yeah.
And then if I go across to the next one, I've got all the sound effect ones. Some of them are quite good. Like there's a monster one that sounds quite crazy, and yeah, so
cool.
Yeah. So anyway,
I'll have to play around with that stuff.
Yeah, just don't leave it on by accident and go live, I guess, because people, like I said, they'll let you know about it pretty quickly. But yeah, that's the height of my boring life, playing Fortnite with a voice changer. So it doesn't get much more wild than that around here.
Wow, yeah, really, really going crazy there, Steve, during this holiday period.
Yeah, it's wild stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, well, today I think it's supposed to be like 40 degrees Celsius here. So we're just chilling out inside at the moment, recording this podcast. Probably hasn't quite hit 40 degrees just yet, which is 105 or 6 Fahrenheit, I think, for people over in the parts of the world about that. But it's very, very hot today. So yeah, just be chilling inside. Yeah, not too much has been happening around my way as well. Obviously, I went to Vegas for a week to cover CES during this start of this month, which was a lot of fun. So that was good, just chilling out with Balin, covering things crazily, running around, doing all sorts of different things. But since I've been back, yeah, not too much has been happening. I did buy a crushing shredder for all of my palm fronds, which has been working really well. Obviously, I've been thinking of like various different mulching solutions to turn the palm fronds into mulch to just put back onto the garden. A lot of the high-speed ones, the palm fronds just wrap around those things crazily, at least based on my research online.
Oh, they would.
So a lot of people with palm fronds recommended a crushing shredder.
How does that work?
Well, instead of having like 2 like high spinning wheels that push things into the middle, it basically has one slow turning gear. So the cutting disc is this big gear, and it pushes against the edge of the feeding in hole, basically. So it's got one slow moving gear, and then it right up against like a metal side of the plate, basically.
So it's like a high torque type thing.
Yeah. So basically, instead of spinning up really fast to cut the branches or whatever quickly, it shreds it slowly. So you feed it in, it basically just very slowly goes into the system and shreds it up. So it prevents the palm, like the long fibrous palm fronds, from just spinning around the gear and clogging it up.
Sounds like it might be less dangerous as well, because the high-speed ones can chuck stuff back at you pretty quickly.
Yes.
Obviously got to wear safety glasses and you do that with your one, but still stick in the face is not great. So it could do normal tree branches and stuff like that as well?
It can as well, theoretically. I've only really used it for the palm fronds, but palm frond, I've got different types of palm trees at my house, so there's different types of palm fronds. There's one particular type that has like just a very thick stalk on it towards the more fibrous bit at the end. And it has no trouble chewing through the thick thing, provided it gets into the opening hole. Because there is an opening, but the one I've got's kind of got a specific type of hole that kind of restricts you into the
like the shoot size, so it's like 50 mil or something like that.
Yeah, so it restricts you so that it can't, if you try chuck something in that it can't really do, then it's kind of prevented. But yeah, a lot of people were recommending the Ryobi cordless one, and I'm not usually a huge fan of Ryobi stuff, but DeWalt doesn't make one, so the Ryobi cordless one on their 36 volt platform, whatever, has been really good. So I just move it around the garden to exactly where the palm fronds are lying on the ground, feed them in, and then you can just chuck it straight back on the garden. So they've got a corded one as well. I think it's a little more powerful, but the cordless one has been really good. So a lot of the palm frond research that I did was like, this is the the best one, unless you get those you can get, obviously petrol powered ones or whatever, but to do just a palm front at a time, you don't really need one. The electric one seems perfectly fine. And it's got 2 speeds on it and doesn't get clogged particularly easily. So yeah, it's been good so far. So just been slowly working my way around the garden and just mulching all the palm fronds one at a time. Because I used to burn them, but then I thought, I can kind of just return a lot of it just straight to the soil, really. There's some areas of my garden that probably needed a bit of mulch. So I thought if I can make my own, then it's pretty good. So that's been working really well.
Okay, cool. Yeah,
I've heard about mulchers being quite dangerous tools to own, like especially like the petrol ones, and that if you feed logs into them and stuff, they're like you can get pretty seriously injured either from the movement of the log, because they flip around as they try and get fed
they
in.
can fire them back. I've got I've got like a 30 horsepower, quite a powerful big one. Like you have to clip it onto the back of the mower. It's 200, 300 kilo, probably close to 300 kilos. And I use it a bit. It's belt driven. But anything that's like bottle brush, like finer type stuff, just clogs it up. It's a pain in the backside. It'll destroy branches sort of as thick as your wrist very quickly and easily, and just fire that stuff out everywhere. But you got to be careful what you feed into it and how you feed into it. It's a bit of a pain in the butt, and I don't use it that often because of that. But yeah, I'm interested to have a bit of. I was unaware of this type of mulcher that you have, so I'm keen to do a bit of research.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting find, because I under the same impression as you that like you feed in very fibrous stuff into a normal mulcher, and it just
it's not a fun time.
They're not designed for that. But yeah, the one issue I think with the Ryobi one is that it has to feed into the container underneath, because it's a top feeding sort of thing. And so once the container starts getting really full, or at least you've been putting a lot of more of the branchy type stuff into it, if the area directly under the hole is sort of filled and it hasn't spread out to the rest of the box, it can, at that time, you have to sort of go in underneath and pull some of this stuff out.
Yeah, the belt-driven ones, you've constantly got to like reattach belts, or take the entire thing apart because there's been a small branch that's a bit greener than you'd like, and it's wrapped around it. And anyway, it's not nearly as streamlined as you'd like it to be. You've really got to, for that style of mulch, you've really got to spend serious money on a commercial grade one. And even then, there's still a lot of upkeep and maintenance and whatnot. I'm sure there is a bit with this one as well, but I'll do some research.
It's got a self-calibration mode on it, so you can sort of let it run, and then there's a sort of adjusting thing that you can get it to be perfectly in line, so that the gap between the crushing gear and the side is perfectly optimized.
Okay.
But it's a good investment, I guess, for crushing these things. And it's actually, I've got some palm fronds where it's kind of got like a thin stick end, but then quite a large, almost barky sort of end to it that would be attached to the palm itself around the base of the palm.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yep.
And so you can feed in the reverse way with the leaves first. And even though the large barky exterior is actually larger than the hole, it just pulls it through with so much force that it sort of squashes it in and it just sucks it through. And so, I was quite happy with that. So otherwise I'd just have to cut off sort of that end and throw it away. But the fact that it can actually get fed through has been quite good. So long as I don't cut the palms too close to the palm tree, because the very thick ends can sometimes be too large for it. But outside of that, it's worked well. But as I've been moving around the garden, I'll be eventually in the next couple of days moving into areas where there's actually some branches and stuff that have to be done too. So
I'm interested to hear.
See how it goes.
Yeah, on the next podcast, you can tell me about that.
Yeah, cool. Well, we've done a long podcast, probably the longest one ever, but we haven't done a podcast for like a month. So just catching up on a whole bunch of stuff and talking about new products. So it'd be very exciting.
There's a lot we could have talked about. Touched briefly on, I wanted to ask you about the B580 and whether you think that's now an official flop.
We can cover that in the next week's podcast. I'll make a note. We'll talk about that now.
Next week, because we've got... Yeah, cool.
So... that does it for the Hard to Unbox podcast for episode 57. We're back. We didn't cancel the podcast. We were just waiting for new products to talk about. So hopefully you've enjoyed our random discussion about the GeForce 50 series, and we'll continue keeping you updated on the new products as they come in, more podcasts after each one. And yeah, we'll
Are,
talk about all the findings.
are we going to try and do a podcast this Friday?
Yes, I think that's the current
okay.
plan. After the
Cool.
5080, there'll be another podcast
So
later in the week.
There'll be 2 this week. Yep. Gotcha.
Yeah, so to cover all the findings from the 5080 and anything else that's come out. I'm continuing to test DLSS 4 at the moment, so there's going to be some more findings over time as those videos come out, as we cover each of the things with that as well. So there'll be plenty to talk about, and then there's just so many more products coming out at the start of this year. Motherboards, CPUs, probably not even thinking about that stuff, but there are CPUs and motherboards coming out too. So yeah, lots of stuff. So that is for this one. Thanks for listening to the whole episode. If you've made it all the way to the end, really appreciate it. As usual, the YouTube version is available if you want the video version. The audio version is just as good, and you can get that on your feeds or whatever. So yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.